Our program will now begin.
Good afternoon to you all, and I hope that you and your families are faring well during these challenging times that have now become a way of life. The last time that I participated in a town hall or a webinar of this sort was about a month ago. So much has happened since that time. We witnessed a significant uptick in COVID cases and a shocking number of deaths, with an alarmingly hard-hitting impact on Black communities throughout the United States. It is against this backdrop that we witnessed in horror the murder of Mr. Aubrey in Atlanta, Mr. Floyd in Minneapolis, and most recently, Mr. Brooks in Atlanta. And of course, the month before, we witnessed the murder of Ms. Taylor in Kentucky. These unspeakable events sparked massive protests across the United States under the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement that has now gone global. Black Lives Matter leaders and their allies are stridently calling for an end to racial justice. They are dramatically calling for the dismantling of barriers that keep Black citizens and others from achieving their promise and full potential. And they're calling for significant police reform. There have been almost over 3 weeks across the country, consecutive days, that are continuing here and elsewhere. Faculty, staff, and our students have joined many of these protests, not only in the District of Columbia, but also in local communities where many of our faculty, staff, and students reside. And there have been many discussions about issues of racial injustice, not only in a larger society, but also on our campus. My office has organized a series of conversations about racial injustice, a movement towards equity and fairness. And today's launch, we have the privilege to have Mr. Paul Butler, the Albert Brecht Professor of Law at the Georgetown University Law Center, and Professor Robert Patterson, who is the inaugural chair of the African American Studies Department. I am sure that many of you have seen Professor Butler on MSNBC, possibly on CBS or NBC, or even on the 60 Minutes program, where he was showcased and asked to respond to many probing questions about criminal law, given his expertise in that arena. He has served auspiciously as federal prosecutor before being selected to teach and prepare the next generation of lawyers, judges, and legal scholars. Professor Butler is a well-known scholar in criminal law, race law, and critical theory. He is widely published in the leading scholarly journals, and one of his most recent books is titled Chokehold, Policing Black Males. And I'm sure you will hear lots more about the book once he begins being interviewed by Professor Patterson. Professor Butler received his undergraduate degree from Yale University and his Juris Doctorate from Harvard University. More about his background will be revealed, as I mentioned, during his discussion with Dr. Patterson. Now let me say a few words about Dr. Patterson. A very little known secret about him is that he pursued his undergraduate degrees at Georgetown University. Following his matriculation, he went on to Emory University, where he received and earned the master's and his doctoral degrees. He faithfully returned to the Hilltop as an assistant professor, quickly moving through the ranks to associate and now full professor. All the while doing that, he was teaching and mentoring countless books and mentoring countless students and writing several books and scholarly articles in the fields of Black cultural production, racial, politics, and the legacies of slavery. Without any further ado, let me turn the program over to Dr. Patterson and attorney and law professor, Paul Butler. Colleagues, you are certainly in for a treat today.
Rosemary, thank you for that warm and kind introduction. And Professor Butler, thank you for joining me in this conversation this afternoon to launch this important series that we just needed this historical moment. So thank you. So today I'm going to interview Paul and ask him some questions about his background, about his books, and about the contemporary moment and how all of those intersect. So without further ado, so he is the author also of Let's Get Free, a hip hop theory of justice. And I think that that book is an important precursor to Chokehold because it articulates the ways that his biographical, his own experience perhaps lead to some of the arguments he puts forth in the book Chokehold. So, Paul, can you tell us about your experiences as a federal prosecutor and the specific incident that made you decide perhaps being a federal prosecutor is not the career path that you want to continue?
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. My name is Paul Butler, and I represent the people. That's how I used to start my opening statement. I was a prosecutor. I represented the government in criminal court in the District of Columbia, and I used that power to put Black men in prison, and Black women, and Latinx people, and poor people, like a lot of prosecutors. That was pretty much all I did. If you go to the criminal court in the District of Columbia, then or now, you would think that white people don't commit crimes. You would think that white people don't steal, they don't use drugs, they don't get into fights, but Black people, man, those are some bad dudes. During the time that I did that work, I learned some things. My work as a scholar, a teacher, and an activist has been about what I learned. And Robert, you asked about what is it that made me leave the prosecutor's office? Mm-hmm. Two things. One was an intellectual dawning reckoning that I didn't go to law school to put Black people in prison. During the time that I worked as a prosecutor, a study came out that said that half of the young Black men in DC were in the criminal legal system. That means that half of the young brothers either were locked up, awaiting trial, or on probation and parole. And when I thought of the investment of the community in my ability to go to college and go to law school, it didn't seem like the appropriate way of paying back that investment was by putting my own people in prison. The other thing that made me leave the prosecutor's office was more dramatic. I had graduated from using my prosecutorial abilities and the citizens of the District of Columbia to working at the United States Department of Justice. I was working in the public corruption unit, and I was the junior lawyer on the biggest case in the section. We were prosecuting a United States senator for public corruption. And while I was working on that case, I caught a case. I got locked up. I was arrested and then prosecuted for a crime that I didn't commit. It was a silly little Fred and Barney dispute about a parking space. And as you note, Robert, I tell the story of my arrest and trial in the first chapter of my book, Let's Get Free. I want everybody to go out and get that book. So I'm not going to tell you what happened, but I'll give you a hint. Things worked out fine for me. The reason why things worked out fine for me was, first, I had the best defense attorney in the city. My lawyer was Michelle Roberts. She now runs the National Basketball Players Association, but at that time, she was known as the best trial lawyer in DC, a Black woman, former public defender. She's the main reason things worked out fine for me. The other reason that things worked out fine for me was because I had skills. Robert, I literally had prosecuted people in the same courtroom where I was being prosecuted. Things worked out fine for me because I had a kind of social standing. We made sure the jury knew stuff that shouldn't matter, but does. That I'd gone to those fancy schools that the vice president mentioned, that I was a prosecutor myself. The other reason things worked out fine for me was because I was innocent. But when I thought about it, that didn't seem like the most important reason. I would rather have been guilty and helped Michelle Roberts as my defense attorney than been innocent and have a lawyer who didn't have the resources to devote to my case. And so my defense attorney friends get mad when they hear this story because they say you should have known. It shouldn't have taken your own prosecution to teach you about the evils of the American criminal legal process. But unfortunately, it did. What I've said is that experience made a man out of me. It made a Black man out of me.
Mm-hmm. So this is helpful. So I want to ask you two other things, and I'm not going to give away, the crux of the book, but I think you've gestured toward them, and maybe I'll make them as remarks instead, and then move into Chokehold. But the first is, I think part of the point you're pointing out is that you're someone who had been a prosecutor, you have a JD, you have a Ivy School League education, and if you had this encounter, what the criminal justice or injustice system, which we'll get to, then what does this say for people who are under-resourced, a little bit or significantly relative to the resources that you had? So I think that's one point that you make that I think is very worth turning our attention to. But then the second point, and you gestured about this a little bit, so I'm going to say this, I'm not going to really give a lot away, but one of the points that you make in the book is that your defense attorney, Michelle Roberts, had to remind you about not getting angry on the witness stand because that might persuade the jury to have a different outcome. And so I think that is an important point as we transition to Chokehold, where you make the argument that the American criminal legal process and the injustice system is designed, right? That is actually specifically designed to disenfranchise and suppress and criminalize Black people. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, why it is you make that case and how you use Chokehold as the police restraint and a broader metaphor to make that case.
Chokehold is what the police do to you when they want you to do what they're trying to force you to do, but you cannot do it because you cannot breathe. And that seemed like an apt metaphor for the Black experience in the United States. So there's a literal meaning. I was remembering Eric Garner, who was put in an illegal chokehold by the New York Police Department, which killed him as they were trying to arrest him for the crime of selling a single tobacco cigarette on the street. And the officer who put Mr. Garner in the chokehold remained on the force for 5 years after, earning over $100,000 a year, just fired last summer with no criminal charges whatsoever. Chokeholds have been banned by the NYPD for 25 years, but every single year, the department gets hundreds of complaints of officers using those illegal chokeholds. When I wrote the book, the publisher said, the good news for me, the bad news for the world, is that this book, Chokehold: Policing Black Men, is always going to be relevant. It will always be part of the news cycle. And I wish that weren't the case, but sadly, it is. The main idea is that the problem isn't bad apple cops. The problem is the system is working the way it's supposed to. When we look at all of the concerns about the American criminal legal process and all of the critiques, mass incarceration, 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's inmates. When we look at how wretched prison conditions are, when I was a prosecutor and I had to go to a jail or prison to interview a witness, the first thing I would do when I came home was to take a shower. Prisons are wretched places. Even the good ones are horrible, noisy, often violent, smelly, dangerous frequently. When we look at police violence, all of these, my thesis is, are about Black men. It doesn't mean that we're the only subjects of the state's vast power to coerce and control and punish. But when we ask, how did things get this bad? The legal and social response to anxiety and fear of African-American men is the reason why.
That has roots back to chattel slavery. We particularly see it manifest itself in Reconstruction, and then it just moves out to the 20th and 21st century, but seemingly becomes particularly magnified in the 70s, you know, with the end of the Johnson administration and into the Nixon, Reagan, and these ideas of law and order, which is specifically designed to quell Black dissent and dissidents, if they were termed as such, coming out of the 1960s social movement.
Yeah, and it's so important to think about how stereotypes about Black men have traveled over time. So, Professor, you're right to start with chattel slavery, and sometimes people get it twisted. The idea that Black men are violent or that we're criminal-minded is a relatively recent creation. So during slavery, there weren't perceptions that Black men were violent. If you think about the close proximity between enslaved people and white folks, if we were thought of as violent, people would not have wanted us to be so close. So we were comical, we were heathens, we were stupid. But we didn't become violent in the white imaginary until emancipation.
Right, exactly. That trope is very much a part of the Reconstruction lure, and because that becomes yet another reason to justify lynch mobs and other extrajudicial violence towards Black people. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So Paul, let me ask you this. So one of the, so you also make a compelling case that although we hear a lot about chokeholds because they often result in death, there are a range of forces that police officers or law enforcement can use that sometimes is supposed to be progressive, right, to get the outcome that they want. And they often may go directly to the chokehold. Could you talk a little bit so people can know about those other examples of force that we necessarily don't hear much about, but that are certainly a part of the general arsenal that law enforcement has?
So President Obama's Commission on 21st Century Policing said that the problem with too many departments is that cops think of themselves as warriors. And the better model Obama's commission recommended is guardians. And if you think about who's going to apply for a job as a warrior, that person's going to have a certain kind of resume and skill set that's very different from somebody who's applying for a job to be a guardian. And when you look at what police departments call use of force continuums, you see warriors on steroids. Mm-hmm. So these are documents in which police are trained what kind of violence is appropriate for what kind of situation.
Right.
So they start with an officer's command presence.
Mm-hmm.
So she can use her body, her voice, her gestures in order to get cooperation. If that doesn't work, then she starts next with non-lethal force. So think about batons, think about fists. Cops beat up a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Think about handcuffs. Think about tasers and stun guns. And if that doesn't work, then you go up the chain to deadly force. And almost every professional police department has a document that has these various levels of violence plainly stated. I include in Chokehold, my book, some of the use of force continuums from major departments, but you can Google your own city or state and see if your local police department has one of these use of force continuums. It'll blow your mind when you see how rational, how calculated violence in policing is.
You know, and I think it's also important to think about the ways that race is always entering those conversations, right? And so if you already think of Black people as being criminals, or you think of Black people as always being a threat by virtue of their Blackness, then the notion that they are threatening, that the threat is immediate or imminent might be heightened. And so you escalate the use of force, a deadly force, much more quickly than you would otherwise in other situations.
When white folks see a Black man who they don't know, a part of the brain that's associated with fear is activated. We could talk about implicit bias, or we can talk about straight up stereotypes and prejudice against African American men. Now, I don't think that cops are any more racist than law professors or politicians or anybody else. But I don't know about how it works over at the college, Robert, but at the law school, we're not licensed to kill.
Well, right, exactly.
So that's the difference that bias and policing makes.
That the outcome of it can be very different. And so, you know, one of the points, Paul, that I talk about, so in my race and racism class, the students read parts of the Department of Justice's report on Ferguson and on Baltimore City Police Department. And, you know, part of what the report makes very clear is the way that there's a culture of racial bias, racism that's rooted in history and et cetera. But the students always have an interesting conversation because they talk about, you know, to search someone, you need to have reasonable suspicion. And so we have a very energetic conversation about what suspicion is reasonable when Blackness is already suspicious. And, you know, and so that seems to be, it's sort of a circular argument. And then when you've been harassed by the police because of race, you know, the Supreme Court, you know this better than I do, I think there's something in the 80s or 90s where you have to prove that it wasn't only race that impacted the interaction or what have you. And so that ruling effectually, you know, threw out any type of case that tried to center the way that race would be operating in interaction.
Yeah, so Robert, you mentioned the Ferguson report. Mm-hmm. Well, first, a shout out to Georgetown. We have some of the world's best experts on these issues, including in the law school, the woman who wrote the Ferguson report, Christy Lopez, before she came to Georgetown Law, worked as in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. She spent months in Ferguson and put together with her team a report that I think is one of the defining cultural artifacts of our time. 100 years from now, when people wonder what was it like to be alive in 2020, the Ferguson report is one of the documents they'll go to. It's this amazing synthesis of data and stories. The data, every single time the Ferguson police used a dog, they used it against a Black person.
Right.
The stories are even more heart-wrenching. Just one quickly. She calls the police because he's beating her up.
Yes, yes.
By the time the Ferguson police got there, he was gone.
Right.
Police look around, does he live here?
And arrested her.
Yes, he does.
Yeah.
They say you're under arrest for occupancy permit violation. His name not on the lease. When that happened to another woman in Ferguson, she said she would never call the police again. She didn't care if she was being killed.
Yeah.
Why do the police do this? They do it because they can. Exactly. So when I say the system's working the way it's supposed to, first of all, I mean systems. So we know there's not one criminal legal system. There are many systems. At the law school, we often focus on court cases, the Supreme Court. So there's a case in which the cops were trying to stop a knucklehead kid in Atlanta for speeding. 19-year-old young Black man should have stopped when the cops were trying to pull him over. He didn't. Leads the cops on a high-speed chase throughout the city of Atlanta. And Robert, you know Atlanta, so there's a part of town called the Bluffs. Mm-hmm. When the cops got there and decided that this kid just wasn't going to stop, they decided to kill him. And the way that they were going to kill him was to ram his car over one of the bluffs. They did it. Car falls many feet, bursts into flames. The young man fortunately survives, but he's rendered a quadriplegic. The question before the US Supreme Court was, can the police do that? They were just trying to stop the guy for speeding. They had his ID, so even if they let him go, they could have caught him later. The Supreme Court said it was perfectly constitutional.
Absolutely.
Because he was creating a deadly risk by avoiding the police. Never mind, the cops could have stopped that risk by chasing him. They didn't have to. And you can go look at case after case and see the Supreme Court giving what I call superpowers to police. Right. But the deal is, Robert, the understanding is that these superpowers will be selectively applied against you and me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so Michelle Alexander makes a similar point in the new Jim Crow, where she talks about, you know, police having, she doesn't use superpower to your language, but that's what she says. And then the part that goes hand in hand to make it what we might call a double whammy is that the prosecutors have super discretion. And so when you put those two together, then the problems can be magnified. So I want to also say to our attendees, I meant to say this earlier, we will be taking questions. So we want you to type your questions in the Q&A box. You can find that at the bottom of the screen in Zoom. And I have a couple more questions before we move to that point, but I didn't mean to announce that earlier. And so I want to say that too. So Paul, part of your book gives practical advice to parents, families, individuals who find that they may have an unfortunate encounter with law enforcement. So can you just you don't have to give the advice, but can you talk quickly about or briefly about why it is you felt it was important to include that type of information in the book?
You know, the book started out a few years ago as what publishers call a quickie book. The publisher wanted me to do something really quick that was a guide to African-American men about how to avoid interactions with the cops, and if you do catch a case, how to have the best outcome. They wanted me to keep it real as a critical race theorist, and also as a Black man who beat my case, to talk about the things that I did that helped me not wind up as one of those many African-American men who was locked up. So while I was working on that, Trayvon Martin got killed.
Okay.
Followed by Michael Brown in Ferguson, Sandra Bland in Texas, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Eric Garner in Staten Island. And suddenly the idea of a book about what Black men should do to have better outcomes didn't seem to rise to the occasion. Trayvon Martin didn't need a male role model. He was on his way to his dad's house when he was gunned down. Michael Brown in Ferguson was supposed to start college the week after the police killed him. And so that idea of how Black men should deal with the police, should deal with prosecutors if they catch a case, became a chapter in the book and a video. So if you look at my Instagram page, it's Law Prof Butler. You'll see a 7 or 8 minute video that I'd highly recommend, especially for young folks of color, that has very practical tips. Now, this isn't the same as the talk that many parents give kids of color. It's kind of more keeping it real advice. Some of it's been controversial. And I say, for example, if you're going to court, you're a Black man, if you got braids, cut them off. If you're going to go to a jury trial or have an extended appearance in front of a judge, you have to look in a way that they find respectable. I hate it.
Right.
I say that the country that Black men live in is not free. You shouldn't have to change your appearance. You shouldn't have to conform to somebody's idea of what's respectable. But when I was working on that chapter, my kind of working subtitle, it was never going to be the title of the actual title of the book. But my working subtitle was based on another book that I read. And that book's title was, I'm Here to Get My Baby Out of Jail.
Right.
And so keeping it real advice about how to stay out of jail. If the police stop you, how to prevent the encounter from going to a frisk to an arrest. And again, based on my own experience as a prosecutor and as an African-American man.
That you're not promoting, that you're not saying this is the way it should be in terms of having to cut one's hair and appear a certain way, but you understand how people are read in those contexts. And we know that to be the case too. So very practical and helpful in that way.
I mean, it was scary. I asked my police officer friends, what is it that makes you look extra hard at a brother? They said, if 2 Black men are play fighting, if it's 3 or more Black men in a car, they'll start that hard stare. Black man with a white woman, a Black man in a Black SUV, just crazy stuff that people need to know. And so what I say is, mad respect to the brothers who sag. I think having your pants hanging down your butt looks ridiculous, but that's what kids do. That's what they're supposed to do. And the fact that you choose to sag doesn't mean that you should get that hard stare from the cops. But the reality is that's what police work is, the hard stare at African Americans, and especially at young Black men. So if you don't feel like dealing with the cops that day, yes, you have a constitutional right to sag, but you might not want to exercise it on that particular day.
And we know from Stop and Frisk in New York that really drives home your point in terms of the justification and who was predominantly targeted. So speaking of subtitles, so before I get some of your, your renegade prosecutors' radical thoughts, and I won't get many of them, I want to ask you 2 questions, one about Minneapolis and then one about Georgia. So the first is with regards to Floyd and one of the conversations you had on MSNBC when they initially announced 3rd degree murder charges against the officers. And there you explained, you know, why that made sense. And I think you focused on intent and the burden of proof. And then, you know, since obviously they've upgraded the charges to second degree. And so I wanted to know if you could briefly talk about why you thought third degree made sense and what is your opinion on second degree charges?
So I often think of myself as a scholar, which I think makes sense. Sometimes I think of myself as an activist too. I don't know about that. Robert, do you ever think of yourself as an activist?
Oh yeah. I do.
Yeah. So especially from the scholar part, I'm interested in evidence and data. People used to talk about being tough on crime. The mantra for police reform is being smart on crime. So looking at evidence-based practices. And one of the concerns about police violence is we don't have a lot of data about it. There's no national requirements that when police kill folks, it's got to be reported to any database, at least nothing that's enforced. So some of the bills that are pending now before Congress would require that kind of reporting. So what we do know is that the police kill somewhere around 1,000 people every year. The vast majority of those killings are ruled justified. We know that in the last 15 years, somewhere around 100 officers have been prosecuted for murder, 100. And the vast majority of those cops have walked. They've been found not guilty or have the charges dismissed by a judge. It's really difficult to convict a police officer for a shooting that she did in the line of duty. It's tough because the law is biased in favor of the cop. It's tough because a lot of times the other witnesses for the prosecution are cops, and they're sympathetic to the defendant. And they might even try to sabotage the case. And it's also tough because jurors are frequently sympathetic to the police officer as well. They think, well, even if he made a mistake, he was just trying to do his job. And so when I look at the cases, the murder prosecutions in Minnesota and Georgia, I know that the odds are against conviction, and especially conviction for murder. So in Minnesota, the original charge was third-degree murder, which made sense to me because in Minnesota, intent to kill doesn't have to be proven for third-degree murder. You just have to prove that the defendant demonstrated reckless indifference to human life, kind of like putting your knee on somebody's neck for 9 minutes. Intent to kill, again, a lot of people look at that video and say, yeah, that cop was trying to kill Mr. Floyd, but you have to persuade beyond a reasonable doubt 12 people from Minnesota.
Right.
And if one disagrees with that, then the prosecution loses.
Right.
And so, again, it's daunting odds to try to convict a cop of murder.
So in Minnesota, just the last thing on this point, though, he didn't get rid of the third degree charge. He just added the second degree so that they could, if what you said holds true, they could conceivably convict on the third and not the second.
Yeah, so second degree murder in Minnesota has what's called felony murder. Right. So they still don't have to prove intent to kill. Right. The prosecution's theory is if they can prove that the cop intended to assault, aggravated assault Mr. Floyd, and the death happened as a result, they still get their murder charge. It's all about punishment. So the punishment for murder, including second degree murder in Georgia, is 40 years in prison.
Right.
And the family, Mr. Floyd's family, thought that third degree, that didn't reflect the gravity of the crime, and I totally get that. Right. But just as there is a symbolic value to branding this killer cop a murderer. There's also an expressive value if the government loses the case.
Right.
If there's not a conviction, that would mean that the atrocity that the whole world saw on videotape is not a crime. So I think this is a case that the prosecution has to win. And in order to win it, they have to be really careful with their charges.
It looks like, so I want to move into, I had one more question, but I think I might defer that into the, because I want to go into the question and answers to give our participants some time, but I'll just tell you what they were because I think they're worth people thinking about. So the first one had to do with, in Georgia, there were two, maybe three prosecutorial teams and prosecutors who decided initially not to pursue charges against the Arbery's murderers. And then, you know, another one comes along and they're like, and the tape is released and they say, well, actually there's evidence here. And police officers are saying, I told them, the early investigators, this or what have you. And so in that type of incident, I guess this just gets passed off as prosecutorial discretion and that there's no sort of accountability, because again, I guess it goes back to intent. And unless you could prove that those prosecutors explicitly did something to kind of, you know, violate the law, what have you, then it could be chalked up to prosecutorial discretion. They're deciding not to charge. Do I understand that correctly?
You got that exactly right. Prosecutors are the most powerful actors in our criminal legal process. They have way more power than judges because they have the discretion to decide whether charges should be brought or not. And there's no judge who can overturn that discretion. So any cop, any prosecutor will tell you that there's lots of guilty people who the cop could arrest, right, or the prosecutor could bring charges against, who they don't,
right,
for whatever reason, and they don't gotta explain nothing to nobody.
Right. Absolutely. So thank you. And then the last question would have been, but this is all the more reason for you all to buy Chokehold. It's just a fabulous book. But aside from that, it was going to say, what are your radical thoughts about how to reform the system? But I'm actually not going to ask you that because you do lay that out. So we have about 12 minutes that I can take questions. I'll announce when we're at the last question I'm able to ask. And then Vice President Kilkenny, after that question is answered, will come back into your view to close out the panel and let you know about some of the next events in the series. So this question, one I anticipated, would be, or a form of it, what do you think about the idea of police abolition in its relationship to the prospects for more short-term reform?
So there's been a lot of focus on defund the police, and it means different things to different people. What it means to me is this understanding that when people call 911, often, most times, they don't need somebody with a gun and baton and the power to arrest to handle the situation. And in many occasions, having that guy with the gun makes things worse, not better. So if you look at why people call 911, it's usually because of a beef between neighbors, mental health crisis or a crisis in a personal relationship, someone having issues that are the result of homelessness or addiction. And the idea of defund the police is, what if they're more appropriate first responders? What if they're trained mental health professionals to respond to mental health crisis, for example? More broadly, I think of this beautiful, is a strange word to use for this project, but it is artistic in a sense. It's called the Justice Mapping Project. So what it is a map of New York City. Mm-hmm. And certain blocks in New York are colored. They're in blue. And what that means is just on that one block, the government is spending $1 million to lock up the men, women, and kids on that block. $1 million to keep folks in prison. So what divest the police means is what if rather than spending that $1 million on policing and prosecuting those children and adults, we spend it on healthcare.
Right.
We spend it on violence prevention. We spend it on education and job training. So it's intentionally provocative to say abolish the police or defund the police. I don't know about you, Robert, but if there was a movement to defund Georgetown professors, I sure wouldn't like that. But what I get is reinvestment.
Yeah.
A way that this used to be described in less provocative terms is justice reinvestment. So taking some of this money that we use to police and lock folks up and put them under the jail, and instead devoting it to community and social services that we know are more effective at making families and communities whole.
Absolutely. And this, I'm going to say this and then go on to the next question, because I think what you just said and what I'm about to say will link them. It's also important to remember that the militarization of the police and the cutting of social programs, be it education, job corps, et cetera, happened in the 80s. And that as those social programs, balloons were being cut, the policing budgets were being expanded. And so that's an important historical moment to note why this perhaps reallocating funds or reinvesting or whatever one might want to use. I think that that's an important history to go there as well. So this question, why I say it links, is about the war on drugs. And it says, is it fair to say that our drug laws are behind many police interactions with African Americans? Therefore, is it fair to say that ending the war on drugs by legalizing most drugs will make an important contribution to solving the problem of racist policing?
I'd say that's half right.
Yeah.
So people have a misunderstanding, many folks do, about who's in prison for what. So it turns out that drug crimes aren't a major driver of prison admissions. And let me be clear about what that means. So for federal prisons, about half of the people locked up are there for drug crimes.
Right.
But you know, when people say it's not a federal case, federal cases are supposed to be big deals. And so only 10% of all inmates are in federal prisons. The vast majority of people who are locked up in state prisons and jails. And in those institutions, just about 20% are there for drug offenses, possessing, selling, using. Again, that's 20% too many, since
Right.
a lot of those are there for crimes that don't need people to be locked up and have the key thrown away. But it's actually violent crime that drives prison admissions. The thing is that a lot of the ways that we've come to understand drug crimes, it turns out the same thing's true for violent offenses. So for example, we think about treatment, not punishment, for drug offenses. It turns out that violence, including violence in the community, is also a public health issue as much as it is a criminal issue. For example, we know that living in a high poverty community with easy access to guns creates a risk that people will suffer homicide, either as victims or as perpetrators. So the way to solve that problem is to get rid of the hood. Just really quickly, at the end of President Obama's term, Ta-Nehisi Coates did a kind of exit interview, and they'd gone back and forth over the years about reparations. And during the exit interview, Coates says to the president, African Americans aren't really doing a whole lot better. And in some ways, we've lost game during this past 8 years, but it's scary because this is the best it's ever going to get for us. We've had an African American president for 8 years. So then Coates says, so how about reparations? What do you think of them now, Mr. President? And what Obama says is he's not crazy about that word, but what he could see is a Marshall Plan for high poverty communities. The Marshall Plan being this huge influx of resources to countries in Western Europe that had been devastated by the Second World War. So a huge influx of resources into high poverty communities would make those neighborhoods much safer than trying to lock up all of the young men.
Right. I mean, I think you make an important point about the money spent, because it's often because it happens along party lines, but we know that social welfare programs are always thought of, oh, it's spending so much money, it's spending so much money. But these law and order programs seem to be spending just as much, if not more as well. So it's about, you know, what motivates those priorities of where to spend that money. And I do think wholeheartedly that it has to do with systemic racism. So this is I think another nice segue based on something you said about Europe a second ago. Do you have any thoughts about how policing in other countries compares to policing in the US? For example, why is it so violent here?
So I was hanging out with a buddy of mine in London, a young black man, actually not so young, my age, black man. And we were in a car trying to go somewhere, and there was a police car that was blocking the road. And my buddy who was driving, he sees the cops on a stoop. So he blows his horn and says, "We're trying to get somewhere. Would you mind getting your car out of the street?" I was like, "Dude, are you trying to get us killed?" He said, "I'm just asking them to move." And the officers, they came up to the car. I'm sweating now. And they said, "We're so sorry. We didn't mean to block the street. We're just giving this woman and her kid a ride home."
Right.
And they got in their car and they drove away. Now, let's not give this story more credit than it deserves. Clearly, people of color, and especially black folks, have issues with the cops in the UK, but not the same extent as in the United States. So 90% of cops in London, in the United Kingdom, don't carry guns. Right. Again, it's that recognition that if a lot of police work is giving people directions or giving people tickets, you don't need a woman with a gun to do that work.
Right.
And they'd say, well, police here have to have guns because a lot of citizens also have guns. Again, it's that idea that it's a war out there. Police work is at points highly dangerous. I've said many times, I don't have the courage to be a police officer, but most times it's really boring. It's really mundane. Well, we see the cops sitting around in their cars, again, doing patrols, trying to do, work that's productive. But a lot of police work is like that. Again, really oppressive conditions, a lot of attention appropriately to the number of officers who are killed in the line of duty. And thank goodness that number has been going down recently over the last several years. But a lot of people don't know that a police officer is much more likely to die by suicide than by homicide. And so one of the blessings of reform and transformation is that it can make police work better for everybody, including the officers themselves.
Okay. So thank you for that, Paul. So it looks like I'm going to ask Rosemary to come back in. It looks like we are winding down. Now, Paul, if you give this last question, this will be the last one. So why do you think Louisville cops have not been arrested for the murder of Breonna Taylor? And the person says, is it something in Kentucky law? Is it a state law that needs to be changed? So I guess the question is that case different from what you've more generally described about the general reluctance to charge police officers or what have you. And so when after you answer this question, Rosemary will come back in and close us out.
So we have to take good news in this space where we can find it. Mm-hmm. So if you'd asked this question a month ago, the answer would have been because the victim is a Black woman as opposed to a Black man. And too often, police violence against African-American women doesn't get the same attention that police violence against African-American men does. And there are people like Kimberly Crenshaw who created this Say Her Name campaign that have done a lot of good work to try to get the issues in policing, the gender issues and the intersectional issues moved to the forefront with some success. So I've been gratified to see that when people talk about George Floyd, when people talk about Rayshard Brooks, they also talk about Breonna Taylor. That's progress. After being killed and beat up, the complaint that police get the most is sexual misconduct. And Black women are most likely to bring that complaint. The reason why the killers of Breonna Taylor haven't been brought to justice, I think, are one, because the killing wasn't on videotape. Right. And it's a damn shame that that has to be part of the calculus, but the reality is that's how it works. The other reason is there has to be something illegal that happened. And when I say the system's working the way it's supposed to, people say, oh, that sounds so conspiratorial. But the reality is that of the 1,000 people who are killed by cops in the United States, again, 99% of those shootings are legal. They're justified. And so in this situation, we have this no-knock warrant, which is a horrible thing. It's police officers who are often not in their uniforms. In the middle of the night, they bang down your door and rush in your house, and you think there's an invasion.
Right.
Now, add to the mix, 50% of homes have a legal gun. Right. You hear somebody busting in your house in the middle of the night, you have a gun, what are you going to do?
Right.
But if you or someone near you has that weapon and aims at the cops, then under the law, they might very well be justified in shooting. Okay. And the interesting thing, though, just to close it out really quickly, is that the cop was finally fired. Exactly. And he was fired because he delivered or he exhibited depraved indifference to human life. That's what the chief said. Well, that's also the standard
for murder,
for homicide.
Right.
And so if they think they've got enough evidence of that to fire the officer,
then it may be coming.
Then yeah, then maybe they could also use that evidence to bring a criminal prosecution.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you. And now turn it over to Rosemary.
Thank you very much, Robert and Paul. Let me extend a heartfelt thank you to both of you for this provocative, informative, and compelling discussion. And the content and quality of it just clearly demonstrate to everyone, and to me especially, the reason why we started this conversation series with you. I want to really express to you, this was very informative. I think you did a fantastic job informing our community, and you may have influenced and inspired some folks to change careers. I'm talking to Paul in particular, in terms of going into the field of law. I also want to take this opportunity to let you all know that this is the first of a series of 7 such conversations that we are going to be conducting over the next 6 weeks. So next week, on July 1st, we have Dr. Adele Meyerwood, professor in the School of Nursing and Health Studies, and Professor Christopher King, who will be discussing the growing crisis of health disparities in American society. And that will be very informative, and you will learn a great deal from them not only about COVID-19, but some of the reasons why we're finding the high incidence of fatalities in the Black community with this disease, COVID-19. So please stay tuned, and over the next few weeks, we will be informing you and updating you on the series and the faculty members who we have invited and who have agreed to participate. Just based upon what you've heard and seen today from Professor Butler and Professor Patterson, we have some phenomenal faculty at Georgetown who are doing amazing work. And so let me thank you both once again and look forward to engaging in further discussions. And for the audience, please continue to talk among yourselves about these issues. And as time goes on, you'll be hearing much more about how the university intends to take advantage of the knowledge that we're gaining from these sessions to begin to look internally within our own institution to see what we can do to change some of the culture here at Georgetown, which does reflect the racism that we have in our society. Once again, thank you, Professor Butler. Thank you, Professor Patterson. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
You're welcome. Take care. Bye-bye.